Funny how schools and the media and the elites never talk about Calvin Coolidge, whose cuts led to one of the greatest eras of growth in our nation's history. Our next guests are here to talk about the story progressives tend to avoid. Amity Schlaze is a historian and director of economic research at the George W. Bush Presidential Center. She has a new book out in February called Coolidge. And Gary Wolfram, author of A Capitalist Manifesto, which has such a nice ring to it. And he's an economic professor at Hillsdale College. Welcome, guys.
Well, thank you for having us.
Amity, I don't think anyone knows anything about Calvin Coolidge. The name may be mildly familiar, but they know nothing about the roaring era his policies brought in.
Well, thank you for asking. If you want to know just one thing about Coolidge, who was president from 1923 to 29, it's that when he left office, the federal budget was lower than when he came in.
Wow, 6 years, and he actually lowered the budget in real terms?
Real terms, nominal terms, with sprinkles on top. Any way you put it, he lowered it, and that's an especial feat in peacetime. He wasn't coming out of the war. We always cut back a little bit after a war, but it was in peacetime. He was determined to go at our nation's economic troubles through the budget, through the spending, rather than in false tax debates like the current one. So that's, the corollary today would be where we should be debating how to cut the budget, not how to change tax rates.
Because that's not even discussed today. No one really talks about cutting the budget. They talk about cutting future increases maybe, or lowering the rate of increase, but there's no talk of actual cuts anywhere.
Well, I don't think you can talk of cuts, really, unless you go after the entitlement programs. You have huge programs that are eating up our capital and getting people to rely more and more on government. I mean, that's part of what the fiscal cliff is about, isn't it? About making entitlement reform to Social Security and Medicare, both of which are making us more dependent on government than making us responsible individuals.
Well, entitlement cuts are out of the question right now, it seems, with the Democrats, and any kind of spending cut is really seen almost as, well, you can't do that. You can't cut spending. But Amity, tell people a little bit about the situation in 1920. We were entering a depression. It's one that most people don't even know about. Things were really bad, and Harding and Coolidge, his successor, went in and slashed the budget by how much?
The budget overall was slashed by half. So imagine if today we said we'll have it. And there are a number of presidents who participated in this, starting, of course, with Wilson coming out of the war. But it was Harding and Coolidge and their logo, their mantra, which is normalcy. Mm-hmm. That was where it was really defined as policy. And it's a wonderful story because if you go back and look at Harding's inauguration in 1921, he said, we don't want any experiments in our economy. No experiments. Let's use the proven system. Not much change, please. So it's the opposite of both President Obama, but also Republicans, in terms of this concept that a politician, a president, must always act. These were men of inaction. And Harding tragically died. He had some problems. He was a bit of a slob, but his policy was right, and Coolidge executed the policies. Coolidge finished the job that Harding started by becoming president and doing it with great discipline and rigor. You're still laughing by being a slob.
I'll take Mr. Slob over Mr. Slick every day of the week.
I mean, the media would be criticizing him. Yes, he helped cut the budget and helped America, but the Lincoln bedroom is filthy. It really is.
Well, I got to know Harding really well in writing this biography of Coolidge because Coolidge was his vice president, waiting in the wings, thinking about it, what's going on. And Harding was a wonderfully compelling guy. If he were here, we would love him. However, he didn't follow through. Very narrow example. Their big entitlement of the period, the thing they needed to cut or not spend, was on veterans. And there were a lot of veterans because World War I was a big war, and a lot of them were men in pain because there were no antibiotics. So imagine you have an unhappy, large constituency. So they created a veterans office, the Veterans Bureau, and they put someone corrupt at the head of it who took kickbacks in the million scale. Yeah. So that was bad because we wanted to do something right for veterans, not too much, and we did something corrupt that didn't help them. Therefore, Harding just isn't a hero that he could be. Coolidge, by contrast, was absolutely a model of probity. Didn't take money for himself, didn't, importantly, have others do it around him, wasn't willing to hire people who were corrupt, and therefore could cut with a good conscience. He could be stingy with a good conscience.
Right. Yeah.
And therefore, we didn't get the bonuses for veterans on the big scale that we got later, or other entitlements. He stopped the entitlements single-handedly, or with two hands, going like this, saying no, no, no. And it's hard to say no and be liked. He deserves a lot of credit for daring to.
Gary, did Coolidge do anything magical other than apply the rules of capitalism?
Well, I think if you apply capitalism and the rule of law and people know what the rules of the game are, then you'll get economic growth. And that's exactly what you saw. And when you have all sorts of uncertainty, because the government's intervening in your health care, it's intervening in your financial institutions, then people don't know what the rules of the game are, and they fail to invest. And it is the investment that occurred during this period that lasted and set the foundation for the economic growth that we got.
I mean, we have a country now where you have, the Republican side, the side that's supposed to want to spend less, basically ran on this cut of $716 billion out of Medicare, which was just a cut in the increases that were coming later. Was it just because the media wasn't the same back then? I mean, I can't imagine someone coming up and saying 50% cuts. They would be treated. How would they do
not
that?
over a 10-year period of time. In 2 years.
In a few years, they did it. Well, they were honest with the people. That's important. One of the things I did for the Coolidge bio was look at the budgeting process, because some of this is process. And they got a new law. Harding had a wonderful new budget law in 1921, and they used that law, and the president at that time could impound money. He could hold money back, even if it was already budgeted, if he deemed the project not worthy. So he would say, you got 2 pencils this year. I see you used 1.5. Give me that half pencil back. And they really did. And they were quite stiff with the government itself about spending and saving. And every half year they hauled the whole administration, imagine cabinet heads, really important people, into an auditorium, the president and his budget director, and lectured them about being better savers. And they created little clubs. It's almost amazing to watch. It's created little clubs. You're in the 2% club if you manage to cut your budget 2%. You're in the 1% club if you cut your budget 1%. You're in the woodpecker club if you chipped away at spending in your department. And we kind of find this sort of condescending, lectured by our boss. But it's important for the government to send a signal that it wants fiscal discipline, and then its employees do follow better. So some of it was greater stuff that Gary and we have all studied, such as they had tax cuts that made the economy grow, not just tax cuts that sound good, but ones that made the economy grow. So the government got some money to cover its deficits, but other aspects were attitude. Coolidge even monitored the White House household carefully, and he was quite suspicious of the housekeeper because he said she served an awful lot of hams, and he thought she might have fewer hams, and she passed from the workplace, and a new lady came in, Miss Riley, and Miss Riley submitted the budget penny by penny to the president and was able to cut the White House budget by several thousand, which was a lot then. So I think some of it's an attitude that why do you do this? Not just because you're Scrooge. You do it because every penny that's saved by the government is a penny more the American people have to spend on progress.
Right.
So it's not just because he's mean. And the veterans recognized that the president cared about them very much. He visited them. He worked on the programs that there were, but he wasn't going to create whole new giant entitlements.
And you should know, by the way, progress is a 4-letter word on this set. We asked you not to use that language.
Okay. Progress and economic progress.
Okay.
Growth
right.
Progress.
Okay, we can handle that.
But Gary, a lot has changed since 1920. So how do we pull this off today? How do we pull off massive spending cuts? Because we can't even talk about 5% anymore, let alone 50%. How do we pull this off?
Well, I think there's only one way, and that's to win the battle of ideas. I mean, and that's what your show is about. I think that's what Hillsdale College is about. There's Amity is about. That's what my book is about. It's try to win that battle of ideas so people understand how markets work. You get students going through the K-12 education system today that have absolutely no idea how the market capitalist system works. In fact, 1.2 million people woke up in Dallas today, and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee, and there was exactly the right amount of donuts, and exactly the right amount of everything else, with absolutely no one in charge. You know, that's just a wonderful, wondrous system.
And yet, it's perceived as evil by today's youth.
And they don't see and observe. And I think these tax cuts for the rich, that whole argument is a class warfare argument that Mises warned us about in the 1920s. He was writing in 1927. He wrote Liberalism. 1920, he wrote Socialism. And he warned us about this, that people will perceive things as class warfare, but capitalism, there's no conflict between the wealthy and the poor. In fact, how did you get wealthy? You got wealthy basically by making stuff, and making mostly stuff for the poor. I mean, if you take the average person today that's poor, Robert Rector's done work at this at the Heritage Foundation, the average poor household in the United States, 80% of them have air conditioning. I mean, if you really sort of think about it, the lifestyle of a person who is lower middle class or even poor is not hugely different than it is from the very rich. 3/4 of these poor households have a car. So Bill Gates has a car, you have a car, not quite the same car, but nonetheless, the difference between being poor in the United States and being enormously wealthy in the United States is very different than being poor in the United States and poor in the Sudan.
Yeah. I mean, the stat we always talk about is someone at our poverty level is better off than 85% of the rest of the world.
Yes.
So when you talk about, well, the rich, the wealthiest people should pay more, the world looks at us and says, hey, you guys are the ones that should be paying more. I mean, they don't see it in the same terms we do, and I think the middle class in America, when they really hear those arguments, they're not going to like them so much. Amity, Gary, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And go out and get their books. I mean, it's capitalism. Help the economy.